Okay, so get this. We're taking a deep dive today into, well, transracialism, trying to, really understand it.
It's definitely a loaded term.
Yeah, and I have to admit, even just saying it out loud feels, I don't know, a little strange. Like immediately it makes you think about transgender identity, right?
Right. And that comparison, well, it's tricky. It's not a perfect analogy, and it can actually be pretty problematic for some people.
Yeah, for sure. But look, it's a conversation that's happening, so we got to try to unpack it.
Exactly. So, I guess to start, maybe we should define what we're actually talking about when we say transracialism.
Yeah, good point. So, like, where do we even begin with that?
Well, the basic idea is this. It's about people identifying with a race different from their assigned race at birth.
Oh, okay, but I mean, people could appreciate other cultures, right? Like maybe they love the food, the music, their traditions, but that doesn't mean they're transracial.
Right, that's a really important distinction. It's not just about liking or adopting certain aspects of a culture, it's deeper than that. It's about feeling a really deep sense of belonging to a racial group, even if it doesn't align with your biological ancestry.
So it's about identity then, but like,
Yeah.
how does that square with the whole concept of race itself? Like, isn't race more than just how we see ourselves?
Absolutely. It's really the core of the issue, right? How do we even define race?
Hmm.
It's way more complex than it might seem at first. I mean, for a long time, we thought about it purely biological terms.
Like skin color and those kinds of things.
Exactly. But anthropologists are, well, they're increasingly moving away from that view. They're recognizing that race is as much a social construct as it is biological.
Okay, so like, what does that even mean? If it's not just biology, then how do we define race?
Well, we brought this Wikipedia article on race, human categorization, because it actually lays this out pretty well.
Oh,
Like, think about how many different racial categories exist around the world, and they've changed so much throughout history. So it's not like there's some, fixed biological reality.
that makes sense.
And the article even talks about the Human Genome Project. Remember, they mapped out our entire genetic makeup. Well, they found that there's no single gene that's exclusive to any one population.
Whoa, really?
Yeah, it's pretty amazing. Like, on a genetic level, we're all remarkably similar. So it challenges that whole idea of distinct biological races.
Okay, so if it's not just about our genes, then what's the story?
It's about, well, a bunch of things. History, social factors, power dynamics, all of that plays a role. Societies decide how to classify people based on appearance, ancestry, all sorts of stuff. And it can be really different depending on where you are in the world. Like, take Brazil, for example.
Oh, yeah, I've heard that Brazil has a very different way of looking at race than, say, the U.S.
It's way more fluid. They've historically recognized like over a dozen racial categories, all based on different combinations of physical features.
Wow, that's a lot.
And there was this survey in Rio de Janeiro back in 2000, and it showed that a ton of Brazilians report having multiple ancestries. So it's not so clear cut.
Yeah, that's definitely different from the U.S. We've historically had this one-drop rule, right? Like any trace of African ancestry, and you were considered black. Super rigid.
Exactly. And that context is, well, it's really important when we talk about transracialism. It forces us to think about whether race is this fixed, unchanging thing, or if it's more, I don't know, flexible and shaped by society.
So, like, is it something you're born with or something you can kind of, like, choose?
That's the million-dollar question. And to be honest, there are people who believe that you can choose your race, that it aligns with your internal identity. We even found this TikTok video where someone talks about race as being about skin color, hair, Andy culture.
Oh, wow.
It's a really interesting take, right? It makes you think about what it really means to belong to a racial group.
Definitely. But that brings up some, well, some potentially sensitive issues. Like, what about cultural appropriation?
Yeah, that's one of the biggest arguments against the whole idea of transracialism. Like, are people just appropriating or trivializing the experiences of actual racial minorities?
Right, because there's a difference between appreciating a culture and, like, trying to become something you're not.
Absolutely. And this debate popped up in a really interesting way on Reddit. There was this whole discussion about Michael Jackson's racial identity.
Oh, yeah, that's a complex one.
For sure. Some
Yeah.
people were arguing that he was, a proud black man who had vitiligo, which causes loss of pigmentation in the skin.
Right.
But others were suggesting that his changing appearance was, well, maybe a deliberate attempt to distance himself from his blackness.
It's hard to know what was going on there.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It just shows how challenging it can be to understand someone's personal experiences and motivations, especially when we're talking about public figures.
It feels like we're wrestling with this fundamental question, like, can you really choose your race?
It's the big one, isn't it? It gets right to the heart of the debate surrounding transracialism. If race is largely a social construct, does that mean it's something imposed on us?
Instead of something we can choose for ourselves.
Yeah. But then how do we make sense of people who genuinely feel like they belong to a different racial group than the one they were assigned at birth?
It's like this tension between respecting individual choice and, recognizing the realities of race and how society views it.
You got it. That tension is at the heart of what we're exploring here. We're trying to understand this concept of transracialism identifying with a race different from your assigned race at birth. But at the same time, we have to acknowledge how complex race itself is. And, those concerns about cultural appropriation, they're valid.
Yeah, totally. So we've established that transracialism is about this internal sense of belonging to a racial group that, maybe doesn't match your ancestry. But what does that look like in practice?
That's a great question, and that's what we're going to get into next. We'll look at some specific examples and unpack all the different ways people try to navigate this really complicated world of race and identity. So how does it look, transracialism in action? Well, it can be a bit of a mixed bag. It's not always, a black and white situation.
Yeah, I imagine there's a whole spectrum of experiences.
Exactly. Some folks who identify as transracial, they really focus on cultural immersion. Like they might go all in on the traditions, the language, even the customs of that racial group they identify with.
So it's like really connecting with the cultural side of things.
Yeah, and for some people it goes even deeper. It's not just, appreciation, it's like this profound sense of belonging. Like
Hmm.
they resonate with that cultural context on a really deep level.
It reminds me of that YouTube video we watched
Yeah.
from for Freedom. The speaker was talking about feeling like a shapeshifter, trying to navigate a world that doesn't really get their experience.
Right.
Does that like tie into what we're talking about here?
Oh, totally. That video really highlights that internal struggle. The one that a lot of transracial individuals deal with. Like, they feel this disconnect between their assigned race and their, like, true inner identity. And that can lead to this feeling of not really being seen or understood by others.
Yeah, that sounds really tough.
It can be incredibly isolating
Yeah.
and often makes people search for, like a sense of belonging and affirmation. And for some, that search might involve changing their physical appearance to align more closely with the race they identify with.
So like changing hairstyles or maybe even things like cosmetic procedures.
Sometimes, yeah. But then that brings up the whole cultural appropriation issue again, right? Like, where's the line between appreciating a culture and, like, straight up appropriating it? It's a tough one.
Definitely. And I think that transracial, what does science say? Article really gets into that, right?
Yeah, it goes deep into the ethics of all this, especially when it comes to those cosmetic procedures. Like, are they harmful physically and culturally?
It seems like there's definitely potential for harm. I mean, things like skin lightening or darkening treatments can be pretty risky.
Exactly. And then there's the surgery thing, trying to achieve features that are associated with a different race. Some people say it just reinforces those harmful stereotypes we were talking about.
So it's bigger than just an individual choice, right?
Yeah.
It affects how we view race as a whole. But then what about people who say that changing your appearance is just another form of personal expression? Like getting a tattoo or piercing?
It's a good point, and it just shows how complicated this whole thing is. Opponents of transracialism would say that race isn't just about how you look, it's about lived experiences.
Like the history of discrimination and prejudice that racial minorities have faced. You can't just like choose that.
Exactly. It's not something you can just adopt or appropriate through, like, outward changes.
So we're back to that tension between individual autonomy and the reality of what race means in society.
Right. Is there a way to find, like, a middle ground? It's an ongoing conversation for sure. And to even start to find common ground, we need to be open to dialogue.
Right.
Really listen to each other and understand where everyone is coming from.
Totally. It's about recognizing that everyone's experience is unique, but also acknowledging that broader societal context, like you said.
Exactly. So we've talked about cultural immersion and changing your appearance. Are there other ways that people express, like, a transracial identity?
Yeah, are there other things people do?
Well, for some folks, it's more about internal identification and finding a community with others who, get it. They might get involved in discussions about race and identity, find mentors within that racial group they connect with, and really contribute to those spaces that focus on transracial experiences.
So it's a personal journey of, like, self-discovery and also seeking validation from others who understand what it's like to navigate that identity. But even with all these different ways of expressing it, we still haven't really answered that core question, right?
The big one.
Yeah, like, can you truly belong to a racial group that's different from your, biological ancestry?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? And it stirs up a lot of strong feelings, personal experiences, and honestly, a lot of baggage that our society carries.
It feels like we're really in the deep end now. Do you think
Yeah.
it would be helpful to, like, take a step back and look at the bigger picture for a sec?
I think so. This whole discussion about transracialism, it makes us think about some really fundamental questions about identity, about belonging, about what race even is in the first place.
It's a conversation that feels more and more relevant, as our world becomes more interconnected and diverse. So how do we even move forward in a way that respects all sides of this?
That's what we'll get into as we wrap up this deep dive. We'll try to, unpack the broader implications of transracialism and see if we can find any paths forward in this very complex conversation.
So we've spent all this time, breaking down transracialism. We've looked at how people define it, the arguments for and against, and even like the different ways people try to express this identity.
Yeah.
It's definitely one of those topics that, well, gets people talking.
Yeah.
And it raises some really fundamental questions about like race and identity and all that.
Yeah.
But okay, where do we go from here?
Yeah. It's the big question, and this isn't just some, theoretical debate, right? It plays out in the real world and touches on some seriously sensitive issues.
Oh, sure.
Like, one of the biggest worries people have is that this whole transracialism thing could, like, trivialize the experiences of racial minorities. The folks who've actually faced centuries of oppression and discrimination.
Right, like if anyone can just choose their race, doesn't that kind of undermine the struggles that people of color have gone through just because of who they are? It's like saying those systemic inequalities don't even matter.
Exactly. It's like you could just erase them with a personal choice, which,
Yeah.
obviously isn't how it works. So we got to be really careful and sensitive about how we talk about this stuff.
Definitely. But then there's that whole other side of it, right? The argument about individual choice.
Hmm.
Like, shouldn't people be able to define their own identity, even if it goes against how we traditionally think about race?
Right. And that's where things get super messy. How do we balance individual choice with the realities of what race actually means in our society?
Yeah, it feels like we're trying to, like, fit two totally different puzzle pieces together.
I think maybe finding that balance starts with understanding that there isn't one right answer. Transracialism is, well, it's complicated. There are so many different experiences and motivations. It's not about judging people. It's about trying to understand where they're coming from and having a real conversation about race, identity, belonging, all of that.
Yeah, it's like we're all learning as we go.
Totally.
This whole conversation, it makes you think about your own understanding of race,
Yeah.
and how it affects how you see yourself and other people.
Yeah, absolutely. This whole deep dive, I mean, it's really pushed us to think about how race is constructed, and the power structures it creates, and even that whole idea of what it means to belong somewhere. But maybe the most important thing it's shown us is, well, the need for empathy, for understanding.
Well said.
We need more of that, especially
Yeah.
with these kinds of tough issues.
So we've covered a ton today. I feel like I've learned a lot about uh, transracialism, but I
Yeah.
also have a lot to like think about now. Is there like one big takeaway you'd want our listeners to walk away with?
If I had to pick one thing, it would be to approach these conversations with an open mind. Be ready to learn. The stuff is hard, there's no easy answers. But if we can talk about it honestly, listen to each other, and recognize that everyone deserves respect, well, maybe we can start to understand this whole complex issue a little better.
I think that's a great place to leave it. This has been our deep dive into the world of transracialism. And, hey, listener, we hope you found it, insightful, maybe thought-provoking, even a little, I don't know, unsettling. Because let's be real, sometimes those are the conversations that really matter, right? The ones that make you question what you thought you knew and push you out of your comfort zone a bit.